Chapter 3 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 3. Almost in front of the house stood a closed carriage with two fine horses, but the coachman was looking up anxiously toward the next building. The sound of the closing door drew the man's attention, and catching Gordon's eye, he made as if to jump down and throw open the door of the carriage. Quick as a flash, Gordon saw he had been mistaken for the man the carriage awaited, and he determined to make use of the circumstance. "Don't get down!" he called to the man, taking chances. "It's very late already. I'll open the door. Drive for all you're worth." He jumped in and slammed the carriage door behind him, and in a second more the horses were flying down the street. A glance from the back window showed an excited group of his fellow guests standing at the open door of the mansion he had just left, pointing toward his carriage and wildly gesticulating. He surmised that his host was already at the telephone calling for his own private detective. Gordon could scarcely believe his senses that he had accomplished his mission in flight so far, and yet he knew his situation was most precarious. Where he was going he neither knew nor cared. When he was sure he was far enough from the house, he would call to the driver and give him directions. But first he must make sure that the precious paper was safely stowed away, in case he should be caught and searched. They might be coming after him with motorcycles in a minute or two. Carefully rolling the paper into a tiny compass, he slipped it into a hollow gold case which was among the things in the envelope the chief had given him. There was a fine chain attached to the case, and the whole looked innocently like a gold pencil. The chain he slipped about his neck, dropping the case down inside his collar. That done, he breathed more freely. Only from his dead body should they take that away. Then he hastily put on the false eyebrows, mustache, and goatee which had been provided for his disguise, and pulling on a pair of light gloves, he felt more fit to evade detection. He was just beginning to think what he should say to the driver about taking him to the station, for it was important that he get out of the city at once, when, glancing out of the window to see what part of the city he was being taken through, he became aware of an auto close beside the carriage, keeping pace with it, and two men stretching their necks as if to look into the carriage window at him. He withdrew to the shadow instantly so that they could not see him, but the one quick glance he had made him sure that one of his pursuers was the short, thick-set man with the cruel jaw who had sat across from him at the dinner table a few minutes before. If this were so, he had practically no chance at all of escape, for what was a carriage against a swift-moving car, and what was he against a whole city full of strangers and enemies? If he attempted to drop from the carriage on the other side and escape into the darkness, he had but a chance of 1,000 at not being seen, and he could not hope to hide and get away in this unknown part of the city. Yet he must take his chance somehow, for the carriage must sooner or later get somewhere and be obliged to face his pursuers. To make matters worse, just at the instant when he had decided to jump at the next dark place and was measuring the distance with his eye, his hand even being outstretched to grasp the door handle, a blustering, boisterous motorcycle burst into full bloom just where he intended to jump, and the man who rode it was in uniform. He dodged back into the darkness of the carriage again that he might not be seen, and the motorcycle came so near that its rider turned a white face and looked in. He felt that his time had come and his cause was lost. It had not yet occurred to him that the men who were pursuing him would hardly be likely to call in municipal aid in their search, lest their own duplicity would be discovered. He reasoned that he was dealing with desperate men who would stop at nothing to get back the original cipher paper and stop his mouth. He was well aware that only death would be considered a sufficient silencer for him after what he had seen at Mr. Holman's dinner table, for the evidence he could give would involve the honor of every man who had sat there. He saw in a flash that the two henchmen, whom he was sure were even now riding in the car on his right, had been at the table for the purpose of silencing him if he showed any signs of giving trouble. The wonder was that any of them dared call in a stranger on a matter of such grave import, which meant ruin to them all if they were found out. but probably they had reasoned that every man had his price, and had intended to offer him a share of the booty. It was likely that the chief had caused it to be understood by them that he was the right kind of man for their purpose. Yet, of course, they had taken precautions, and now they had him well caught, an auto on one side, a motor cycle on the other, and no telling how many more behind. He had been a fool to get into this carriage. He might have known it would only trap him to his death. There seemed absolutely no chance for escape now, yet he must fight to the last. He put his hand on his revolver to make sure it was easy to get at, tried to think whether it would not be better to chew up and swallow that cipher message rather than to run the risk of its falling again into the hands of the enemy, decided that he must carry it intact to his chief if possible, and finally that he must make a dash for safety at once, when just then the carriage turned briskly into a wide driveway, and the attendant auto and motorcycle dropped behind as if puzzled at the move. The carriage stopped short, and a bright light from an open doorway was flung into his face. There seemed to be high stone walls on one side, and the lighted doorway on the other hand evidently led into a great stone building. He could hear the puffing of the car and cycle just behind. A wild notion that the carriage had been placed in front of the house to trap him in case he tried to escape, and that he had been brought to prison, flitted through his mind. His hand was on his revolver as the coachman jumped down to fling open the carriage door, for he intended to fight for his liberty to the last. He glanced back through the carriage window, and the lights of the auto glared in his face. The short, thick-set man was getting out of the car, and the motorcyclist had stood his machine up against the wall and was coming toward the carriage. Escape was going to be practically impossible. A wild thought of dashing out the opposite door of his carriage, boldly seizing the motorcycle and making off on it, passed through his mind, and then the door on his left was flung open, and the carriage was immediately surrounded by 6 excited men in evening dress, all talking at once. "Here you are at last!" they chorused. "Where is the best man?" shouted someone from the doorway. "Hasn't he come either?" And as if in answer one of the men by the carriage door wheeled and called excitedly, "Yes, he's come! Tell him! Tell Jeff! Tell him he's come!" Then turning once more to Gordon, he seized him by the arm and cried, "Come on, quickly! There isn't a minute to wait. The organist is fairly frantic. Everybody has been just as nervous as could be. We couldn't very well go on without you, you know. But don't let that worry you. It's all right now you've come. Forget it, old man, and hustle." Dimly Gordon perceived above the sound of subdued hubbub that an organ was playing, and even as he listened it burst into the joyous notes of the wedding march. It dawned upon him that this was not a prison to which he had come, but a church; not a courtroom, but a wedding; and horror of horrors, they took him for the best man. His disguise had been his undoing. How was he to get out of this scrape, and with his pursuers just behind? "Let me explain," he began, and wondered what he could explain. "There's no time for explanations now, man. I tell you the organ has begun the march. We're expected to be marching down that middle aisle this very minute, and Jeff is waiting for us in the chapel. I sent the signal to the bride and another to the organist the minute we sighted you. Come on! Everybody knows your boat was late coming in. You don't need to explain a thing till afterwards." At that moment one of the ushers moved aside, and the short, thick-set man stepped between, the light shining full upon his face, and Gordon knew him positively for the man who had sat opposite him at the table a few minutes before. He was peering eagerly into the carriage door, and Gordon saw his only escape was into the church. With his heart pounding like a trip hammer, he yielded himself to the 6 ushers, who swept the little pursuer aside as if he had been a fly, and literally bore Gordon up the steps and into the church door. A burst of music filled his senses, and dazzling lights, glimpses of flowers, palms, and beautiful garments bewildered him. His one thought was for escape from his pursuers. Would they follow him into the church and drag him out in the presence of all these people, or would they be thrown off the track for a little while and give him opportunity yet to get away? He looked around wildly for a place of exit, but he was in the hands of the insistent ushers. One of them chattered to him in a